Welcome to Revenge Report. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's dive in. I sat in the courtroom, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, trying not to stare at my father. He was up front, talking quietly to his lawyer, completely unaware that I was the prosecutor. He looked the same as he always had. Broad shoulders, hands that were always moving like he was preparing for action, like he was still the sheriff in a town that had long since moved on. The room smelled like polished wood and old papers. My fingers drummed lightly on the desk in front of me as I let the weight of it sink in. This was it, the biggest case of my career, and the man who had shaped every part of my life was sitting there, about to answer for everything he'd done. "You're a disappointment," his last words to me when I left home after college. I never told anyone what he said. I never wanted to admit it to myself. But it was there, in the back of my head, every time I tried to do something that mattered, anything that wasn't just desk work. I knew, even as a kid, that nothing I did was ever good enough for him. He'd been the sheriff in our small Mississippi town for as long as I could remember, revered by everyone. My older brother followed in his footsteps, became a deputy. He was their golden boy, the one who got the praise, the awards. I was just the girl who liked to read, who spent too much time thinking about numbers and laws. When I became an investigator for the state auditor's office, my father had just smiled like I'd said something ridiculous. "Desk work," he'd muttered. The courtroom called to order, and I steadied myself. This was it. The case was ready. I had the evidence, the facts, everything that would take him down. Every time I thought of him sitting there, I felt the sting of his last words, but I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about family. This was about justice. I stood, cleared my throat, and prepared to make my opening statement. My father's legacy might have been set in stone for everyone else, but for me, this was the beginning of the end. I steadied my breathing, the same way I always did before stepping into a room full of people who already had their minds made up about me. The party was loud, full of small-town chatter and forced smiles, but it felt like a haze. My father's retirement party for his deputy, the kind of event where everyone played their parts, fawning over each other and pretending like the years hadn't passed. I hadn't been back in this town for more than a few months after getting my state job, but everyone still treated me like I'd never left, like I was just the sheriff's daughter. They loved my brother, always had, and tonight they were practically worshiping him. "Sheriff's kid, huh?" a guy I didn't recognize said, clapping my brother on the back. "You'll make the family proud." "Hell, you already are." My brother grinned, taking the praise like he was used to it, like it was his due. The applause from the group was deafening, but I didn't need to hear it to know what they were saying. My brother was the one they cared about, always had been, the weight of it pressed down on me harder than I wanted to admit. And me? I was in the background, just the woman in a state-issued blazer, the numbers girl. I wasn't law enforcement, wasn't a rising star. "You still crunching numbers, Jess?" A voice I recognized broke through the crowd. My cousin, Sarah. She smiled like it was a joke. I forced a smile back. "Yeah, someone's got to." Sarah let out a soft laugh, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Right. Probably teaching night school too, huh? Good luck with that." Her words landed, sharp and deliberate. She was still holding on to the same tired idea that I was just another disappointment, another failure who hadn't lived up to the family name. I wanted to fire back, tell her that I was doing more with my life than anyone in this room ever would. But instead, I nodded and kept my mouth shut. My brother gave me an awkward glance like he wasn't sure where to place me in the grand picture. Hell, neither did I anymore. I excused myself and walked toward the door, the sounds of laughter following me, but I couldn't shake the anger crawling up from my stomach. I tried to remind myself that none of this mattered, that the work I was doing mattered, but that's a lot harder to hold on to when it feels like everyone around you is writing you off. I didn't stop walking until I was in my car, the cool leather seat pressing against the back of my legs. The drive home felt like it took forever, but I knew it wasn't the road stretching out in front of me that was the problem. It was the weight in my chest, the feeling that, no matter what I accomplished, I'd always be that girl, the one who wasn't good enough to make her father proud, the one who wasn't part of the team. But that night, something else rose up with it, something I wasn't going to bury again. It was determination. I was going to show them all, especially my father, that I wasn't the disappointment they thought I was. I was going to prove I could be more than just someone to be brushed aside. I wasn't sure exactly how yet, but I'd get there. I always had a way of getting where I needed to go, even when it seemed impossible. And this time, I was going to make damn sure the world saw it too. I sat at my desk, the fluorescent lights above flickering like they always did, casting that sterile glow on the pile of files in front of me. It was supposed to be just another routine audit, checking vendor payments for rural road maintenance contracts. Nothing too glamorous, just the usual paperwork. Except something didn't add up. At first, it was minor, just a few payments that seemed off, nothing that would make anyone raise an eyebrow. But the deeper I dug, the more the numbers seemed wrong. Payments to companies that didn't exist, invoices signed off by names I couldn't trace, contracts that looked like they were pulled from a template instead of actual work. I pulled the file on each contractor involved, flipped through the invoices, the communications, the bids. And then it hit me. The contracts weren't going to legitimate companies, they were going to shell companies. The kind of companies set up for one purpose: to launder money. I ran bank records, matching payment histories with what was listed on the vendor forms. Sure enough, the money was being funneled into accounts with no real business behind them. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was deliberate, calculated, systematic theft. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the blood drain from my face as the pieces started to click into place. My father's name was on the authorizations, his signature, his stamp. It was there, plain as day. I froze, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself I was wrong, that I'd missed something. But the evidence didn't lie. My father, the man who'd always been a hero in this town, who'd built his reputation on justice, was in the middle of a massive embezzlement scheme. I double-checked everything, combed through the documents again, scrutinizing every number, every detail. It was worse than I thought. This wasn't just a few bad deals. This was millions of dollars siphoned off over the course of years. Roads never paved, maintenance never done. But the checks had cleared. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't some distant scandal I could ignore or pretend didn't affect me. This was my father, the sheriff who'd built this town, the man who'd always told me to stay in my lane, to not make waves. And now he was the reason those waves were crashing over me. I forwarded everything I had to my supervisor, detailing the discrepancies and providing all the evidence. My hands shook as I hit send, like I was sending a bomb into the world I'd always known. The phone rang not long after. My boss wanted a meeting. "We're referring this to the state's corruption task force," he told me, his voice measured. But I could hear the tension in it. "This is beyond us." I nodded, but my stomach twisted. There was no turning back now. The next words out of his mouth stung. "We need someone to lead the investigation. Someone with forensic accounting expertise, someone who knows the law, someone who can handle what's about to come." I knew where this was going. "You want me to do it?" "You're the best we've got," he said, "and we need this handled quickly. This is a big case, Jess. It's going to get ugly." "Right." I barely managed to force the word out. My mind raced. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let anyone else take this on. It was my father, my case. "Let's do it," I said, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. He paused. "This could ruin you, Jess. You're going up against the sheriff, and you know what that means. It's your career, your future." "I'm not worried about that," I interrupted. "I'll handle it." He sighed like he knew I wouldn't back down. "All right then, we'll set it up." I hung up the phone and sat there in the quiet for a long time, trying to find some part of me that wasn't shaking. But there was no escaping it anymore. This wasn't just about numbers or contracts or audits. It was about everything I'd spent my life running from. I was going to bring my father down, and no one, not even me, knew what that would cost. The weeks dragged on, and the case slowly came together, piece by piece. Every document, every phone call, every invoice. I dug through it all with precision, determination. There was no room for mistakes. The corruption task force was expecting me to lead this with no hesitation, no room for doubt. So I didn't give myself any. I worked through the nights, poring over data, cross-referencing, making sure everything lined up. I couldn't afford to be wrong. My father was out there, walking around like the same hero he'd always been. I hated that about this town. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the man they thought they knew. Every time I saw his face, plastered on some flyer or at another local event, I felt the ache in my chest. One of those events was a barbecue fundraiser at the community center. The heat was unbearable, the thick Mississippi air making it hard to breathe. But it didn't stop the crowd from gathering around, from fawning over him like he was some sort of legend. I had to force myself not to walk out the second I saw him. But duty pulled me in. My father was standing in the middle of a group of business owners, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. As if he didn't know what I was about to do, his arm draped casually over the shoulders of a local contractor who had once been on the receiving end of one of those questionable payments. "God, it's good to see you, Rick," my father said, slapping the guy on the back. "We've been through a lot together, huh? You've always had my back." The contractor laughed, a nervous, uneasy sound, but he played along. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Sheriff." They all laughed, and there he was, my father, still the untouchable hero. I could feel my blood heating, my stomach turning as I stood in the crowd, hearing them praise him, hearing them speak of him as if he hadn't been draining this town dry for years. It was a slap in the face. I turned away before I lost my nerve, heading toward the far corner of the room where a few people were standing quietly, nursing their drinks. That's when I saw my brother. He was standing by the door, hands in his pockets, his lieutenant badge gleaming under the low lights. He caught my eye and started walking toward me, that same smug expression on his face. "You're really doing this, huh?" he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I heard some state agents are sniffing around Dad. You know how this town works? You might want to watch your back." I kept my face neutral, but it took everything in me not to snap back at him. "Probably just doing their jobs." "Sure," he said, taking a step closer, his tone more condescending than concerned. "Just, some people might think you're doing this out of jealousy. After all, Dad was always the real man of the family." I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Maybe," I said, forcing a smile. "But that's not why I'm here." He didn't respond, just gave me one last look before turning to walk away, heading toward the crowd that still adored him. He didn't know what I knew, and I had no intention of telling him. The truth would come out soon enough, whether he liked it or not. Back home, it was the same routine. The weight of the case pressed down on me every night as I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread out in front of me, my eyes growing heavy as I reviewed the evidence over and over. I couldn't afford to miss a single detail. The case was scheduled for the preliminary hearing in just a few days. The date was set. The judge had already agreed to hear the evidence, and once we got that far, there would be no turning back. I stared at the pages in front of me, the invoices, the emails, the phone records. It was all there, clear as day, and still I couldn't shake the image of my father, standing at the front of that room, laughing with the same people he'd stolen from. They still didn't see it. They didn't know what I knew, but they would. This wasn't about justice for me anymore. It was about everything I'd worked for, everything I'd been dismissed for, the life I'd tried to build to show that I wasn't a disappointment. This case, this fight, it was mine, and I wouldn't let anyone, not even my father, take it from me. The courthouse smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of place where time seemed to settle in every crack. I walked through the doors, feeling the weight of every step. My heels clicked against the tile, sharp and deliberate. The bailiff nodded as I passed, and I made my way to the front. The judge greeted me with a formal smile. "Ms. Hamilton," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We're glad to have you with us." I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. He was a man I knew well enough, but today it felt like I was stepping into a different world. A world where I wasn't just the sheriff's daughter, I was something else entirely now. I didn't look at my father at first. I couldn't. I knew exactly where he was sitting, just a few rows in front of me, talking quietly to his lawyer, smiling like he was still the same man who had carried this town on his back for so many years. He hadn't seen me yet, and I was thankful for that. I needed a moment to steel myself before everything went to hell. My brother was sitting behind him, leaning back in his chair with that same smug confidence, like he already knew how this was going to play out, like it wasn't even possible for the sheriff to be guilty of anything. I took a deep breath, turning my attention to the podium. The room was quiet, expectant. Then it happened. The clerk called the court to order, and the moment I'd been dreading for months arrived. "Will the lead prosecutor please step forward?" My heart slammed against my chest, but I didn't hesitate. I stood smoothing my suit jacket as I walked to the front. I could feel the eyes in the room on me, some curious, others judgmental, but there was no turning back. As I made my way to the podium, I glanced at my father. This time, his eyes met mine. For a moment, there was nothing, just an uncomfortable silence. His eyes widened, and then his face went still. It was like he didn't recognize me anymore, like I was a stranger standing there in front of him. And I hated that. I hated the way he stared at me, like I wasn't his daughter, like I wasn't even human to him anymore. Behind him, I saw my brother blink, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. I had always been his little sister. He had always been the one to brush me aside. But this was different. This was real. The judge called for order, and I took a steadying breath. I stand before you today, I said, my voice steady, but with a sharp edge, to present the case against Franklin Hamilton, the former sheriff of this county, who used his position to embezzle millions of dollars from public funds. For years, he signed contracts, approved payments, and turned a blind eye to the misuse of taxpayer money, all for his own benefit. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. I didn't need to rush. I had all the time I needed to lay this out, and I wasn't going to let anyone forget what was at stake. The evidence will show that Mr. Hamilton took advantage of his position, allowing companies to receive payments for services never rendered. We have bank records, invoices, and testimony that will prove he orchestrated this scheme, siphoning off funds meant for this county's roads into his own pockets. I let my eyes flicker over to my father, who was sitting stiffly now, his face pale. The look on his face almost made me falter, but I didn't let it. I couldn't afford to. You will hear from witnesses who were coerced into participating in these kickback schemes, I continued. The people who trusted Mr. Hamilton were lied to, manipulated, and threatened. He betrayed not just the law, but the very people who put him in power. A murmur ran through the room, and I saw my brother stiffen behind my father. His eyes didn't leave me. I kept my focus forward, on the judge. I will show you everything you need to see, and when you do, I trust you'll make the right decision. The silence in the room felt like it stretched forever. I wasn't sure if it was the tension or the weight of what I'd just said, but I knew that nothing was going to be the same after today. When I finished, I stepped back from the podium and returned to my seat, keeping my back straight, my face impassive. But inside, it was all I could do not to let the storm of emotions break through. This was just the beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom had grown tense, the air thick with anticipation as I presented the evidence. I wasn't nervous. There was no room for nerves. This was the culmination of everything I'd worked for. Every long night I'd spent hunched over a computer, piecing together the facts. It didn't matter that my father was sitting a few feet away, his face expressionless, or that my brother was watching me like I'd just thrown a grenade into the middle of everything they'd ever known. The first piece of evidence was a stack of forged invoices. I placed them on the table in front of me, tapping them for emphasis. These invoices are all fraudulent, I said, my voice cutting through the murmur in the room. Services were never rendered, yet payments were approved, routed through shell companies with no physical address or staff. I could feel my father's eyes on me, but he never met mine. His gaze stayed on the table, on his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture stiff and controlled. I wasn't sure if he was trying to block me out or simply couldn't look at me anymore. Either way, it didn't matter. I had a job to do. I moved on to the next batch of evidence. Contracts awarded to companies with no experience in roadwork, companies that existed only on paper, fake addresses, fake tax IDs. I laid out every detail, watching the judge take notes. The defense attorney sprang to his feet with an objection, his voice sharp and challenging. "Objection, Your Honor! This is circumstantial at best. These documents don't prove anything." The judge didn't even flinch. "Objection overruled," he said. The defense attorney sputtered, but the judge wasn't having it. The next few objections were shot down just as quickly, and I could see the frustration building on the other side. The witnesses started testifying. One by one, contractors who had once worked with my father stood up, their voices shaky but clear. Each one explained how they had been coerced into participating in kickback schemes, how they had feared for their jobs, for their livelihoods, if they didn't comply. One of the witnesses, a contractor I recognized from the town, described how my father had personally approved payments for services that were never performed. He even recalled the threats made when he asked questions about the transactions. My father didn't react. He didn't shift in his seat or glance up. He just stared ahead, as though nothing in the world could break through his shield. But I could see it in my brother. I watched him stiffen as the testimony mounted, his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes flickering between the defense attorney and the witness, then to me. I didn't look at him directly, but I could feel the tension radiating from his side of the room. It was like I could hear the wheels in his head turning, like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't real, that it wasn't happening. I kept going. I wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when it was finally coming to light. 2 decades of deception. 2 decades of stolen money, broken trust, and ruined lives. Every lie my father had told was coming out, and there was no way to take it back. I wasn't here for vengeance. I wasn't here to make anyone suffer. I was here to show the world what had been hidden, and nothing, not even my family, was going to make me flinch. The judge called for a recess after the last contractor finished his testimony. I didn't move as the courtroom emptied, the buzz of quiet conversations filling the air. I kept my eyes on my notes, focusing on the next steps, on the next round of evidence. That's when I saw him. My brother was walking toward me, his face tight, his jaw clenched. I didn't look up at first, but I could feel him getting closer. When he finally stopped at my side, I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time in hours. "You're really doing this?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, a tremor of disbelief in it. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I met his gaze head on. "Yeah, I am." He swallowed hard, and for a second I thought he might say more. But he didn't. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. I could see the conflict in his eyes, confusion, anger, something else I couldn't name. But I didn't wait for him to work through it. I turned my attention back to my notes, my mind already on what was coming next. I didn't have time for this. I didn't have time to explain myself, to make him understand. This was bigger than us now. I heard him exhale, the sound heavy with frustration, before he walked away. I didn't look back. I was already moving on to the next part of the case. The case was wearing me down. Not physically. I could handle the late nights, the endless paperwork, the pressure. No, it was the weight of the thing that kept dragging me under. I had been working on this for months, but every day felt like I was chipping away at something that had been built up for decades, something that had always been bigger than me. I remembered my first field audit, back when I was fresh out of college, full of idealism. I was assigned to a small, insignificant county contract, the kind of thing most people overlooked. I was excited to prove myself, but when I found discrepancies, when I pointed them out to my superior, he didn't praise me. Instead, he pulled me aside and said, "Don't ruffle feathers, Jess. You want to keep your job. You learn to play the game." It stung then, and it still stung now. I wanted to change things. I wanted to be the one who made sure the people in charge actually followed the rules. But back then, I was told to stay in my lane. And when I brought up public integrity to my father, when I told him I wanted to do something with meaning, he didn't encourage me. He just looked at me, like I was a child who didn't understand how things worked. "Stay in your lane," he'd said. "There's no room for idealism in this world, Jess. You'll learn that soon enough." I had learned it, all right. I had learned it the hard way. Now, sitting in that courtroom, watching as people I had known my entire life shifted uncomfortably in their seats, I realized just how far I had come, how far they had pushed me. They had expected me to stay in my lane, but I had refused. The last witness took the stand, a former city planner. He was an older man, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. I had known him since I was a child. He had been part of the town for as long as I could remember. He paused before speaking, looking around the courtroom like he was trying to find the courage. They were afraid," he said, his voice cracking. "Everyone was afraid of the sheriff. He had a way of making people do things they didn't want to do. He would threaten to ruin careers if you didn't play along." His words hit like a punch to the gut. I knew exactly what he was talking about. My father's power had always been rooted in fear. He made people afraid to question him, afraid to stand up to him. He'd built a reputation that stretched far beyond the county line, a reputation that was now unraveling before everyone in that room. The gallery, filled with people from my childhood, shifted uncomfortably. I could hear the whispers starting. The realization was spreading. They had always seen my father as a hero, a man who could do no wrong. But now they were seeing him for what he really was, a criminal. I didn't feel satisfaction, not the way I thought I would. Instead, I felt something heavier, a sense of finality. This wasn't about me proving a point anymore. This was about making sure the truth was known, no matter what it cost. I looked at the faces around me, people who had known my father, people who had worshipped him. Now, their expressions were changing. Their admiration was turning into confusion, disbelief, and fear. I watched it all without flinching. The room was shifting, but I wasn't going to be swayed. This wasn't about family loyalty or saving face for anyone. This was about doing what was right, no matter the fallout. The former city planner's testimony continued, but I barely heard the rest of it. I was lost in the hum of voices, the tension hanging heavy in the air. I knew this was just the beginning. The fallout was going to be massive. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I couldn't. The truth was out, and no matter how much it hurt, it needed to be seen. My father's legacy was crumbling, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it now. The room was heavy with tension as the judge looked over the documents one last time. I could feel the eyes on me, people whispering, shifting in their seats. I knew what they were thinking. They didn't have to say it aloud for me to hear the judgment in their silence. The sheriff's daughter had just torn apart everything they believed in. The judge cleared his throat, the room falling quiet. After reviewing the evidence presented, I find there is sufficient cause to proceed to trial, he said, his voice steady. Bail for the defendant will be set with conditions. He is to surrender his passport and be confined to his residence with a monitor until further notice. I didn't feel anything in that moment. No triumph, no relief, no satisfaction. Just a cold, unyielding weight pressing down on my chest. I had done what I needed to do. The case was moving forward, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There was a murmur in the gallery as the judge dismissed everyone. The whispers started immediately, quiet but insistent, like a ripple spreading through a crowd. I stood there, my mind still sharp, but the sounds around me blurred together. People who had once looked at me like I was part of their family now avoided my gaze, stepping around me as they filed out of the courtroom. I could feel the sting of their eyes as they passed by, their judgment heavier than I could bear. My aunt was one of the first to leave. Her eyes narrowed as she shot me a look that could have frozen ice. She didn't say anything, but I didn't need her to. Her glare said everything. It said that I had betrayed the family. It said that I was the one who'd ruined everything. I watched as my cousin followed her, shaking her head, her lips barely moving as she muttered under her breath. Traitor! I let the words roll off me. They could think whatever they wanted. I wasn't here for their approval. I wasn't here to make them understand. I was here for something bigger than their petty judgments. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My father stood up slowly, his face ashen. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off, pushing past the sea of people who were now filing out. He walked toward me with that familiar, controlled anger in his eyes, the same anger he had when I was a little girl and couldn't do anything right in his eyes. You ruined this family, he said, his voice low and venomous. I didn't flinch. I didn't back away. I stood there, meeting his eyes for the first time since the trial had started. You did that yourself, I said, my voice unwavering. I just brought it to light. His eyes darkened, but I could see the flicker of something else in them too, something I had never seen before. Was it regret? Fear? It didn't matter. The words had already been said. The damage had already been done. He didn't respond, just stared at me like I was a stranger. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, still rooted in place. The room was emptying out, but I stayed in the same spot for a long moment. I couldn't quite move, couldn't quite bring myself to leave the courtroom. Everything I had known, everything I had been taught to value, had unraveled right in front of me. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. The family I had spent my life trying to please, trying to earn approval from, had no place in this anymore, and I was finally okay with that. I walked slowly through the nearly empty courthouse, the click of my heels echoing in the silent hall. The weight of the day settled around me like a fog, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. The air outside was cooler than I expected, a breeze cutting through the humidity as I made my way to my car. The parking lot was almost deserted. A few cars remained, their owners either still inside or long gone. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the hum of the car filling the space around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, already knowing who it was. It was my supervisor. You handled that better than most ever could, the text read. I read the words twice, letting them sink in. There was a small part of me that wanted to let it go, to ignore the praise, but another part of me felt a small flicker of relief. It was something, even if it didn't make the heaviness in my chest go away. I shoved the phone into my bag and drove home in silence. The roads were familiar, but everything felt different. I passed the diner where I used to go with my dad, the gas station where I ran errands as a kid, the old post office. All of it felt like a distant memory now, like the town I grew up in had slipped further away with every mile. Back at my apartment, I set my things down by the door. The place was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I didn't need distractions. I needed to focus. I made a quick dinner, nothing fancy, just something to keep me going, and ate it in silence at my kitchen table. The food didn't taste like anything. My mind was still on the case, still replaying the words in court, still feeling the weight of the decision I'd made. I knew what this trial was going to bring. The fallout was just beginning. The town would never see me the same way again. I could already hear the whispers, the calls of betrayal, the looks of disappointment, but none of that mattered. Not anymore. I cleaned up the dishes, moving mechanically as my mind stayed on the case. Back at my desk, I pulled out my notes, the binder filled with everything I had on my father. Every forged document, every witness statement, every single piece of evidence I'd worked so hard to gather. I filed it all away neatly, my fingers moving automatically, making sure everything was in order. Then, I printed out a new trial prep checklist. The final hearing wasn't far off. The weight of it felt like an anchor, but I wasn't going to back down. I opened a new folder, one with a label that was both familiar and strange: State v. Hamilton. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the sheriff's daughter. I wasn't here to carry on some family legacy. I wasn't here to protect a name or a reputation. I was here to do what was right, and that was all that mattered now. Weeks had passed since the preliminary hearing, and now the trial was in full swing. The courthouse lobby felt different today. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the reporters milling around the entrance made it clear that this was no longer a local story. It was bigger than that. The same courthouse I had walked through 100 times before now buzzed with a strange, unfamiliar energy. The town paper's headline that morning had changed tone. My father's name was no longer associated with honor. Now, it was synonymous with betrayal, with corruption, and mine. It was printed alongside the word justice. I didn't know how it had happened, but somehow the people who had once seen me as the sheriff's daughter, the one who could never measure up, had started seeing me differently, at least some of them. I walked past the reporters, trying to ignore the cameras as they flicked toward me. They didn't matter. The people in this building, the ones who had known my father for decades, were the ones I needed to focus on. I wasn't here to make headlines or to score a win for anyone but myself. Inside the courtroom, the buzz continued as lawyers shuffled around, preparing for the next round of testimony. I sat at my desk for a moment, reading through a few last-minute motions, signing a stack of filings that felt endless. The weight of it all was starting to feel more like a heavy coat than a burden. But I was close. The end was in sight. During a break, a young intern, her name was Molly, I remembered, walked up to me cautiously. She was the type who would ask too many questions, her curiosity obvious in the way she stood, waiting for a moment to break through my focus. "Is it hard?" she asked, glancing around as if trying to find the right words. "Going against your own family?" I didn't answer right away. Her question wasn't new. It was the same question everyone had been asking, just phrased a little differently. But she was the first to ask it directly to my face. I looked at her, her eyes wide with some mix of sympathy and genuine curiosity. "Harder than anything I've done," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But necessary." She nodded, but I could see she didn't fully understand. I didn't expect her to. She hadn't grown up like I had, hadn't been raised with a father who demanded everything and yet gave nothing in return. She didn't know what it felt like to fight for your worth your entire life, to feel like you never measured up. The break ended, and I had to shake the thought away. I stood, slipping my badge back on, and ran my fingers along the edge of my coat. This was what I had worked for. No distractions, no regrets. I wasn't going to let anything pull me out of focus. I wasn't the sheriff's daughter anymore. I was my own woman. As I walked back into the courtroom, I took a deep breath. The trial was far from over, but I had already won. Not the way people thought, maybe, but I had won because for the first time, I wasn't measuring myself by my father's expectations or the town's approval. I was measuring myself by my own standards, and that was enough.